In this video, I want to show you all promising underdogs, the best inexpensive favorites, and the best bets to consider for this weekend. I'll also provide my final probability for each fighter's victory, along with their stat differentials. If you find this informative, helpful, or entertaining, please like and subscribe. It really helps keep me motivated to create these videos for you all. I've also added my Patreon information in the description if you want to support me there. There's a $10 a month contribution tier and a $20 a month premium tier. The premium tier gives you early access to all of the analysis and results from my videos, along with the additional data analysis and stats. This includes my prediction model results, fighter history, stat overviews, promising underdogs, best inexpensive favorites, prop bets to consider, and deep dives into each fighter's record and historical fights. So you'll get to see their strengths, their weaknesses, their consistency across different stats, and their stat comparisons versus all of their historical opponents' averages. All of this combined will help you with your picks and bets. There's a $20 a month tier, which is around $5 per event, and you can also purchase each of these separately, but the membership is cheaper and easier. Plus, you're directly helping with the improvement and expansion of the content for this channel. Running this data, analysis, and prediction models takes hours every day and week, so I'd greatly appreciate any support that you can show. And thank you to everyone who has shown me support recently. Also, if you like detailed breakdowns and predictions, I do those weekly for full cards as well, including prelim fights, so feel free to check those out on my channel. Let's go ahead and jump right in. First, let's take a look at promising underdogs. The fighters' names are on the leftmost column, followed by their probability of victory that I presented in the prediction video from earlier this week. These probabilities are not only based on several data science prediction models that are trained for accuracy, but also on qualitative information such as the fighter's momentum, their recent performances, their career's trajectory, psychological factors, their training camps, their weight cuts, and any other available information out there. I've also provided the stat advantages for each fighter compared to their opponent, excluding differentials where one of the fighters has a 0 in their stats in order to avoid misleading information. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. The first promising underdog that I want to highlight for you all is none other than the main event, Merab Dvalishvili, the Machine. So this guy, he absorbs 1.15 less strikes per minute than Sean O'Malley. He lands 6.08 more takedowns on average than O'Malley, and he also has an 18% higher takedown defense. Now, all things considered, using the statistical models that I have, which you have seen earlier this week in the prediction video, all things considered, research, fight film studying, all that good stuff, I ended up giving Merab Dvalishvili a 43.5% probability of victory in this fight. So pretty much 44%. That's not bad at all, and that's why I really want to highlight him as an underdog with a lot of potential in this card, because if you are leaning towards Merab Dvalishvili, if you're looking past some of his trolling tactics and you think that he has a good possibility of pulling off this upset, there is a good chance as an underdog that he has to do so. So let's go ahead and break down the stats first. So just to kind of recap his record here, Merab Dvalishvili has won 17 fights. Now, he's only finished 24% of them, but that does mean that he's controlled a large amount of his fights in order to get a decision victory. That's where his game plan really thrives. He's able to control fights, whether it's grappling, whether it's taking the fight to the ground and just controlling his opponents, so on and so forth. Now, I also want to point out he's had 12 fights in the UFC, and he's won 10 of those 12 fights. And it's very important to understand that this is someone who has climbed the ladder within the UFC. He's done very, very well throughout a multitude of different types of opponents, and now he's finally on the center stage to try to get this championship from O'Malley. And it is important to understand that O'Malley obviously he's a striker. Merab, obviously more of a grappler. And it's kind of important to understand historically how that has played out between two fighters. When you have a grappler versus a striker, generally speaking, the grappler has won more times than the striker has. Now, there's pros and cons to both of these guys, and that's why it's so close to 50-50 here. But just a key thing to keep in mind between these two, especially if you're leaning towards underdogs. The whole point of this video is to point out opportunities for you guys, so that, if you're not in favor of choosing favorites, you want to look at some underdogs with potentials, you're willing to roll the dice a little bit. That's why I want to highlight these guys for you. So let's go ahead and continue. The last time Merab Dvalishvili lost was 2018. So it's been a long time since this guy has faced a loss. another important key thing to keep in mind. But now, instead of talking about the records and the stats, I really want to talk about some of the game plan and some of the pros to his fighting style that can really help Merab Dvalishvili win in this fight. So for starters, this one's kind of obvious, but I want to point out that he can and will utilize his wrestling and his grappling advantage in this fight to kind of frustrate Sugar Sean O'Malley. So Dvalishvili, I mean, we know him for his relentless wrestling and his multiple takedown attempts. We've talked about how much he averages, those 6.4 takedowns per 15 minutes compared to, of course, O'Malley's not a wrestler, only 0.35. Now, O'Malley does have some decent takedown defense overall, but Merab is a machine. He's going to go constantly and consistently trying to take the fight to the ground to get that path of victory. Now, I also want to highlight the pressure and cardio that Merab is going to bring to this fight. He's known as the cardio machine, right? He has this crazy relentless pace, and he's going to push a high pace, and he's pretty much going to wear O'Malley down over the course of 5 rounds if this fight goes that far, and if O'Malley's not able to catch him. Also, Merab is going to try to close the distance pretty quickly. So O'Malley, generally when he fights, and if you look back at some of his previous fights, you could tell easily that he likes to strike from range, and he uses, his kind of slim height and his reach advantage, which is huge in this division. I mean, he's 5'11", and he fights at 135, so that's a big discrepancy there compared to the average 135er. So Dvalishvili will try to continue forward pressure against O'Malley and then close the distance to try to negate some of that striking advantage that O'Malley brings to this fight. I also want to point out that through observation, it's easy to tell that Merab is very strong when it comes to the clinch, and he works very well from that body lock position, and getting O'Malley into those clinch situations will neutralize some of his striking advantages. It just really depends on how the dynamics of this fight plays out, but I think that is something that Merab is going to bring to this fight. Now, another key thing is that although O'Malley is the more dangerous striker, Merab will try his best to avoid taking some clean shots when he's moving in for takedowns, when he's trying to grapple a little bit, and how good he'll be at that is really left to your imagination at this point because we don't know how it's going to play out. But I'm trying to highlight some of the game plan and strategies that Merab can use and that he's really good at to try to win this fight. So if he does get a takedown, I could see Merab, maintaining top control throughout that round, which could help him, on the scorecards as the fight goes through rounds. O'Malley's going to have to try to put this fight away to the best of his ability. So Dvalishvili, again, like we covered, he's going to push a very high pace. He's going to try to exploit some of O'Malley's takedown defense vulnerabilities, although those have improved over time. O'Malley has improved his takedown defense over time, and he's specifically put an effort to try to train on that to make himself a more well-rounded fighter, especially as he's facing, or as he faced guys like Aljo, etc., etc. But obviously in the division, there's a lot of guys at that top of this division that do lean into wrestling and grappling. So O'Malley has been training on that. Merab does have a good chance of winning, especially as an underdog, but I'm still leaning towards O'Malley as the logical decision in who will win, but there's still, probability-wise, probably a better risk to reward ratio if you're leaning towards Merab. So I wanted to highlight him first and foremost for you guys in this video. This card has a ton of underdogs that have a lot of potential to pull off upsets here. So there's a lot more underdogs than there are decent favorites or inexpensive favorites. So what that means is there's a lot of opportunity if you're willing to roll the dice a little bit. So the next promising underdog that I want to highlight for you guys is Valentina Shevchenko. And this is probably needless to say. Shevchenko being an underdog is insane if you were to tell someone that a few years ago. She has wonderful experience. She's had tremendous fights. She's accomplished a lot throughout her professional fighting career, and that's all experience that she still has. Now the problem is you have an up-and-comer, someone who's done very, very well, especially after a rough start to her UFC career, someone like Alexa Grasso. But that doesn't really take away from some of Valentina Shevchenko's experience, and especially doesn't take away from her mindset as a fighter. If you've seen some of her interviews, you could tell that her mind is in the right place. She's taken this extremely seriously since she was very, very young, and she's taken this way more as a sport Valentina Shevchenko has taken this as a lifestyle, and that's something that I can really admire in a fighter. That's what we want to see in a fighter, someone who develops a lifestyle of it. George St. Pierre is probably one of the best examples of this. And then, some of your other guys like Khabib Nurmagomedov, those are people that really they thrive with that lifestyle. But sorry for deviating. Let's go ahead and break down Valentina Shevchenko's stats, her stat advantages compared to Alexa Grasso, and then look at her record, and then talk about some of those things outside of stats in her record as well. So, Valentina Shevchenko, she has a 9% higher striking accuracy. She absorbs 1.84 less strikes per minute. She has a 4% higher striking defense. She lands 2.15 more takedowns on average. She has an 18% higher takedown accuracy, and she has a 12% higher takedown defense. Now, what I will say is that some of these stats, they're probably skewed towards the prime of her career, which was, a couple or a few years ago. How she performs now, you have to discount some of these stat advantages a little bit as she continues to age throughout her professional fighting career. It's kind of the inevitable downturn that every fighter faces. So, speaking in terms of her record, she's won 23 fights. She's finished 65% of them, which is impressive. She's had 16 fights within the UFC against the best of the best, and she's won 12 of those. So that's still pretty impressive. Now, recently, she's done decent, but she hasn't lived up to a regular Shevchenko-style performance. She's won 3 of her last 5 fights, and she's recently coming off of that draw against Alexa Grasso. So this is a trilogy fight, in case you weren't aware of that. Now, all things considered, in my predictions and all that, I ended up giving Valentina Shevchenko a 49.8% probability of victory. That's damn near 50-50. And for an underdog to have that kind of a reading, that really highlights opportunity here. If you are by yourself leaning towards Valentina Shevchenko, then this could be confirmation that, hey, she's doing pretty well. And that percentage, that probability percentage, it's not just statistical, but it's also after looking, it's adjusted, right? So I have 7 data science prediction models that use machine learning and AI that I coded myself, and it took months, but I used those to get an initial reading, and they use machine learning to spit out these percentages. I have 7 of those. Then I average them to get a weighted average, and then I end up doing a ton of research on both fighters throughout the week or throughout 2 weeks, because it takes a ton of time. But I end up adjusting those statistical percentages in order to account for some of the advantages that stats cannot pick up. And so with all of that considered, I gave Valentina Shevchenko that 49.8% probability of victory. What's interesting, though, is if you watch the video from earlier this week where I go over all the model results and give my detailed predictions, it showed that Valentina Shevchenko was actually the statistical model favorite, if I'm not mistaken. And so I ended up flipping that, and I'm leaning towards Alexa Grasso here. But the point is, they are 50-50 coming into this fight, which definitely highlights some value here. I'm not saying sell the house and go in on Valentina Shevchenko, but if you are willing to roll the dice, again, there's some opportunity there. But let's talk about reasons aside from stats alone as to why exactly can Shevchenko pull off a victory against Alexa Grasso here and get this upset. So the first thing I noticed right off the bat, especially looking at Valentina Shevchenko's previous fights and also looking at Alexa Grasso's, is that Valentina Shevchenko she's the fighter that has a better striking accuracy. So Alexa Grasso, she's good at striking, but Valentina Shevchenko is more accurate and more precise with her strikes. And so I think that she can use that and also leverage her grappling and takedown abilities. Now, keep in mind, she was submitted in the first fight, but she's still really good with takedown and grappling. And that can be advantageous, especially if she's perfected or, at least chiseled out her skills a little bit more. Now, she will have to use her defensive skills in this fight. Keep in mind, Shevchenko does absorb fewer strikes compared to Grasso, and that's not just statistically, but if you look throughout a fight, she does play a little bit better defensively than Grasso does. She kind of avoids damage while countering, and I think that is going to be a huge key. If she's able to avoid some of that damage as she counters and puts on some damage to Alexa Grasso, it can really slow Grasso down, and it can kind of get Valentina ahead, at least in terms of score and also in terms of damage. Now, I will say that Valentina Shevchenko has a lot of experience, and that's a fancy way of saying she's old, but that's also something that highlights that when it comes to very high pressure moments, and this is an extremely high pressure moment for Alexa Grasso, especially being Noche UFC. She's defending her title. She's had this crazy rivalry with Valentina Shevchenko. Two of the best, right? And I'm not saying that Alexa Grasso is not used to pressure, or, that she hasn't had her fair share of high pressure moments, but Valentina Shevchenko has had more. And I think that that's a case to be made. A few more key things that I think Valentina Shevchenko will be able to do, or is very likely able to do, and some strategies and game plans that she's bringing into this fight, is I think she's going to avoid late round mistakes. And so if you look at their previous fights and some of her other previous fights, she's made some costly errors, especially in those later rounds as the fight progresses. So I think that obviously she's someone who perfects her craft. I think that she's going to maintain focus and discipline throughout the full fight, and she's going to make an extra effort in those later rounds in order to not make the same mistakes. That's something that really spoke out to me when I saw the previous footage. Now, I think that Valentina Shevchenko would be smart if she exploits her southpaw stance as well. Valentina Shevchenko, she being a southpaw, you can create a lot of awkward angles in a fight compared to Alexa Grasso, who's more of your typical standard orthodox style fighter. So she really needs to lean into that and make Alexa Grasso very uncomfortable. And she's one of those fighters that definitely can leverage that. I mean, that's why this fight is 49.8% towards Valentina Shevchenko. I also expect Valentina Shevchenko to really lean into her diverse striking. Keep in mind, she has a Muay Thai background that she's perfected ever since she was like 9 or something. Like, she's been doing this her entire life. So if she could mix in those kicks that she's perfected, her knees, her elbows, not just focus on striking and grappling, but also mixing in different types of striking in order to keep Grasso guessing. It really is a game of keeping Grasso guessing, keeping her uncomfortable, because Grasso, once she's able to get a read on an opponent, she does very, very well. So if you don't let her get that read, then you could really get ahead of that race. So the final thing I'll say, just to kind of wrap this one up, is that Shevchenko will have to use a lot of her technical skills and her experience in order to control this fight, but at the same time, she really has to avoid the mistakes that cost her a lot in both of their previous encounters. So as long as she's learned from her mistakes, which she is the fighter to do so, then this is a very 50-50 style fight, which brings a lot of opportunities for us. Now, the next promising underdog that I want to highlight for you guys is Ode Osbourne. And now this one, it's not as high of a probability as Merab or Valentina, but he still has a decent probability as an underdog and probably more value as an opportunity. So let's go ahead and talk about it. He has a height advantage of 1 inch coming into this fight. Now, the key thing that I want to highlight is that he has a reach advantage of 8 inches. And some fighters, or oftentimes, fighters don't use their reach correctly, especially not so much in boxing. In boxing, they actually do. But in UFC and in MMA, they don't really use their reach to their full potential. And maybe you've noticed that as well. Oftentimes, it really has to go side by side with your game plan as a fighter. And Ode Osbourne is generally someone who does use his reach advantage to his advantage. And that's a really good thing, and it can be a key thing in this particular fight. And this next stat that I'm about to share does highlight that as well. Compared to his opponent here, he lands 1.46 more strikes per minute. Because of that reach, his strikes are able to find his opponent more often than his opponent in this fight. He also lands 0.08 more takedowns on average, although that's not very high, and he has a 1% higher takedown defense as well, which is, again, also not that high. Now, all things considered, I did give Ode Osbourne a 41% probability of victory, which, again, it's not so close to 50-50, but it's still close enough to consider for value, especially if you see Ode Osbourne getting the win here. Now, I will talk about those strategic and stylistic things, but first let's cover his record, right? He's had 12 fights. He's finished 75% of them. So again, this leans into using his advantages properly. Now, he's had 9 UFC fights and he's only won 4 of those. And that is a weak point against Ode Osbourne that you need to keep in mind in this fight. Now, another one that is kind of weak is that he's only won 2 of his last 5 fights, and he's coming off of 2 back-to-back losses into this fight, which is why I am leaning towards Rodriguez in this particular fight with about a 60 or 59% probability of victory or so. But that doesn't mean that Ode Osbourne can't get it done. having a 41% probability of victory is still not bad compared to the risk and reward ratio of going for the favorite. And let me tell you why I think that Ode Osbourne has potential to pull off this upset. I'm not saying he will, but I'm saying he has potential to do so, and I want to highlight him on this card. So stylistically, he is someone that utilizes his striking advantage very early on in fights. He's known as that fast starter type of fighter, and he's pretty skilled as a striker as well. Now, using that, he can look to land significant strikes early on in the fight and probably look to potentially score a knockout before Rodriguez even gets comfortable. Now again, a lot of this, he has to exploit his reach advantage here. He has a significant reach advantage, and if he can use that length to keep Rodriguez at distance, and that's a huge if, then he can pick him apart from range and kind of embarrass him on a huge night like tonight. So he also, keeping that in mind, he also has to counter a lot of Rodriguez's striking. And what I'm particularly talking about are those kicks that Rodriguez uses. Now, both of these guys, they really like to counter kick, especially if you look at their previous fights. So Osbourne needs to look to time and counter Rodriguez's kicks in order to continue to score points and potentially open him up for a big shot. As you land some of those kicks or as you throw those kicks, oftentimes fighters leave their face open or their body open, and that's exactly the kind of stuff that Ode Osbourne needs to look for and take advantage of, especially with that reach. I mean, that is a huge opportunity, and I hope he's been training on that. Now, given that, I will say that I've noticed Rodriguez has he has proven cardio, right? He has really good cardio, and Osbourne, on the other hand, if you take a look at some of his longer fights, he kind of fades later on in fights. Now, that's why it's absolutely crucial that if Osbourne wants to win, he has to push a very high pace early on, and if he is, then he could time and tire Rodriguez out. So essentially, he has to look for the knockout. Let's be honest here. Osbourne has that knockout power with him, and Rodriguez, keep in mind, he has been finished by KO before, so if he lands a big shot, he can end this fight quickly and pull off this upset and kind of give us a bang for our buck. He could also, now I know that Ode Osbourne's not huge with his wrestling, right? Especially given what I've seen. It's not his primary strength, but and I don't know if you know this, but Osbourne does have a wrestling background. If he takes the fight to the ground, perhaps, and it could be in a desperate attempt at some point in the fight, but he can negate some of Rodriguez's striking at that point, and that could take away from Rodriguez a little bit. Now, kind of pivoting from that, he has to capitalize on some of Rodriguez's inexperience as a fighter. This is Rodriguez's, I think it's his second UFC fight. And so while Osbourne does have much more octagon experience, he's going to have to leverage that experience and really look like a fighter who's been in the UFC longer than him. So if he uses some of those veteran type of tactics to fluster this younger guy, that will be to his advantage as well. Now, I will say Rodriguez, I am leaning towards Rodriguez just for full disclosure here. The point of this video is to highlight opportunities, right? And kind of back it up using some stats, using the record, and using things that I've observed and studied outside of stats. So Osbourne, no matter what, he's going to have to execute a very strong and strategic game plan here. He's going to have to score early, and he's going to have to take advantage early on in this fight. And he's going to have to be a little bit careful of Rodriguez's advantages in both grappling and some of those striking advantages that he has as well. Keep in mind, Osbourne is coming off of 2 straight losses here, so be a little bit careful, or, if you want to roll the dice, absolutely go ahead. But be a little bit careful if you are leaning towards Ode Osbourne. You guys know I'm just looking out for you at the end of the day. Now, this next one seems to have struck a lot of interest in the comment section. There's a lot of people who disagree with me, which is absolutely fine, by the way. I don't take anything personally. I just love doing research and analysis and sharing my findings with you guys. If you don't agree with me, hey, that's totally fine. But hopefully you're picking up some value in these videos. And if it's not for one particular fight, hopefully it's for a ton of other fights. So let me just preface this by saying it's okay to disagree with me here. This one is a little bit controversial, but the next promising underdog that I want to highlight for you guys is Norma Dumont. And not only do I think she's an underdog with potential, but I'm actually, full disclosure, leaning towards Norma Dumont to pull off a victory here. Although narrow, I'm giving her a 54.1% probability of victory here, so it's going to be 50-50. So if her opponent ends up winning, I mean, just know that that is a pretty close 50-50 prediction here, and it's for a good reason. So let me give you my case and kind of make a case as to why I'm doing this. So Norma Dumont, she's 3 years younger in this fight. She has a 9% higher striking accuracy. She absorbs 4.44 less strikes per minute. She has a 10% higher striking defense. She lands 1.75 more takedowns on average. She has an 18% higher takedown accuracy. Now, if you notice something, I read her stats very, very quickly. Why? Because, and someone made a good point of this in the comment section, but her stats are a little bit padded, and maybe understand that as you will, but her stats are a little bit inflated in this particular case. It might not speak directly to her skill, but just for transparency, I do want to highlight that on paper she has those advantages. It's important to put the context that sometimes stats on paper doesn't really equate to someone's ability or skills. A good example of that is just throwing a couple of non-harming strikes in a clinch or something. I'm just giving you a very vague example of how that can rack up your paper stats, right? But it might not exactly equate to you being a great striker. So just keep that kind of thing in mind. But just also keep in mind that I have incorporated that into my prediction. So I've already kind of discounted the final probability as to what I'm giving Norma Dumont. Anyways, I'm rambling. Let's continue. Norma Dumont, looking at her record, she's won 11 fights. She's only finished 18% of them, but although boring, she has been able to control a majority of her fights. Now, she has had 9 UFC level fights, although not with anyone crazy, but she still had 9 UFC fights, and she's won 7 of those. So she has done decent, and that fact is kind of undeniable. She has recently won 4 out of her last 5 fights, and she's coming off of 4 straight wins in a row. In fact, the last time she lost was back in May of 2022. But here's the key thing. Let's talk about those stylistic reasons as to why I'm leaning towards Dumont. And I really broke it down heavily in my prediction video previously, since I did choose her to win. But I'm going to do a quick summary recap for you guys here in this video. I do recommend you guys go back and look at that video if you haven't already. And if you're new to the channel, thank you for being here, by the way, but I'll give you a quick summary right now just so you're caught up. So a couple of things that I think are working towards Dumont's favor here to give her a slight edge is that she does have really good defensive striking. What I mean by that is that she's pretty decent at avoiding damage while countering pretty effectively. And I think that that's going to be a key thing that works in her favor, as well as her grappling edge in this fight. I think that her takedowns and her grappling advantage here is going to kind of better Irene Aldana's striking. And I could be wrong. Again, close to 50-50, just full disclosure, totally fine. But I think that with her pace control, her adaptability as a fighter, and some of her physical strengths, especially since dropping down to bantamweight, are going to work to her favor. Now, I think that Dumont does have the tools that she needs to neutralize Aldana's high volume striking approach and just her striking approach in general. And I think she'll be able to control the fight through, different kind of a combination of defensive striking and some strategic grappling. So I think that, she's confident coming into this fight. She really believes in herself. Whether I believe in her or not is not really, that sounds like more opinion than logic. So I'm going to stick to the logic here. I think Dumont has a little bit of a better chance of neutralizing Aldana's strengths. But it could be that Aldana picks her apart and, she strikes and it just ends up not going in Dumont's favor. This one's kind of risky, but you do get a bang for your buck going for the underdog. And that's why I'm picking the underdog here, because I think that she does have the advantages to, more times than not, get it done compared to Irene Aldana. You put them up against each other 10 times. I think 6 times Dumont's going to win, and the other 4 times Irene Aldana is going to win. So it's very close here, in my opinion. But she has just enough to have an edge, in my humble opinion. And so you guys take that as you will. You could completely discard this part of the video. Hey, that's fine. Or you could be like, hey, maybe this is an underdog that has potential. One thing I will say is that I don't think that this is going to be a very entertaining or fun fight. So, if you care from an entertainment standpoint, I don't think it's going to be a huge a banger, if you will. All right, so the next promising underdog that I want to highlight for you guys is Manuel Torres. Now, this is another underdog that I am personally picking, and I think he will win. It's not just an underdog with some potential. It's actually an underdog that I personally expect to win based on all my research and analysis. So First, let's break down the stats here. He lands 0.99 more strikes per minute. He has a 12% higher striking accuracy. He absorbs 1.23 less strikes per minute. He has a 3% higher takedown defense, and he lands 1.2 more submissions on average. Now, all things considered, statistical and research outside of stats, I'm giving Manuel Torres a 52% probability of victory, which does set him up as a great underdog to feature, because keep in mind, let's talk about his record. He's won 15 fights. He's finished 93.4% of his fights. He's had 3 fights in the UFC, and he's won all 3 of those fights. Recently, of course, he's won all 5 of his last 5 fights, and in fact, he's coming off of a 6-fight win streak. Last time he lost was actually September of 2019. But let me review some of those reasons aside from stats alone as to why I think Torres will win here. And I touched base on this in a lot of depth in my previous video from this week, but I'll summarize it for you guys here. So I think that he has a lot of paths of victory against someone like Ignacio Bahamondes. Keep in mind, he has a very high first round finishing rate, and I go in depth in my previous video, but I'll just leave it at that. He has an extremely high first round finishing rate. In fact, I think it's like 95% of his fights have been finished in the first round or so. So he has a very aggressive style, and that oftentimes overwhelms opponents, which I do fully expect him to overwhelm Bahamondes early before he could really settle down into this fight and have some advantages that we know Bahamondes to have. He is the favorite. Bahamondes is the favorite in this fight, but I just think Manuel Torres' style, and this is key, this is where the odd makers are just screwy. They don't know this kind of stuff. I think Torres is going to disrupt him and prevent him from really getting comfortable. And I'm not sure if Torres is now the favorite or not. Maybe the lines have changed on this fight. But as I was running this, it was Torres as the underdog. So just keep that in mind in case you're looking at this and you're scratching your head and saying, oh, Torres might be the favorite now, or Torres is the favorite now. So just keep that in mind. Anyways, I will say Torres has superior striking accuracy, and he has a lot of output, and that gives him an edge on the feet. And I think that he can look to land some damaging blows early on that can really just change the story of this fight. Now, here's the great thing about Torres. He's a dual threat when it comes to being a fighter, and I covered this in the previous video, but he is really good at not only with striking, but he's also really good with grappling. And here's how that can play out in this fight. Let's just say, for example, that the striking exchanges are not going the way that we want and according to his plan, right? His usual performance in every single fight with the aggression up front. Let's say that it's not going that way and Ignacio Bahamondes is able to kind of defend his way through that early barrage. If that's the case, keep in mind, Torres does have that wrestling advantage to also change levels and immediately take the fight to the ground. And once he's there, keep in mind, he has a high submission rate. And what it does is it provides another avenue for victory for him. And there's nothing better than a fighter that has multiple methods to win, because that means that he's truly a well-rounded fighter that can take the fight anywhere. He studied multiple martial arts, and that's the whole point of this entire thing at a high level. So keep in mind, Torres does have well-rounded skill set. I don't think that the odds makers are right with this one. And he has an ability to end fights very quickly, and that does make him a dangerous opponent, especially one who's capable of defeating Bahamondes in multiple ways. And that's why I'm leaning towards him. His key to victory will be pushing an absolutely crazy, furious pace early on as soon as the fight starts, and to capitalize on some of his strengths before Bahamondes can find his rhythm. If he can disrupt that rhythm, this is Manuel Torres' fight all the way as an underdog, giving us a lot of value. Alright, now we're going to switch gears, and now I'm going to talk about the promising favorites for this card, which I've chosen through 3 main criteria. First, they have a high statistical weighted confidence either through my prediction models or through fighter stat evaluation, or some combination of both. Second, their opponent does not have a high probability of victory, so you're not going to notice any overlap between the underdogs I just showed you earlier and these fighters. And the third thing is that their odds aren't too expensive. If a fighter has like -600 or -700 odds, they're obviously just too expensive to pick, but you could always parlay them if you want. In this video, I'm going to focus more on finding you guys some value rather than just stating some obvious picks and pointing out those -600 type fighters. So I consider these 3 things for you guys. I do all the work for you guys, and then I show you the valuable picks that fit that criteria. And if you want to know how I predict each fight plays out and the results, please check out my prediction breakdown from earlier this week where I review stats, each fighter's fight history, the results of my 7 data science prediction models, my final picks, and the method of victory. Now for this portion of the video, for these favorites, I'm only going to review their stat differentials that they have against their opponent. But again, if you want those in-depth breakdowns, please refer to that video from earlier this week. It will help you out. Let me be honest with you guys, there's not a lot of favorites in this fight that aren't extreme favorites. So I want to highlight value for you guys, and it's hard to do that when some of the favorites on this card are very, like, huge favorites. So the only favorites I've seen that have a lot of value, there's only 2 of them. You see them on the screen, no surprise. But I'll break down their stat advantages really quickly for you guys before we jump into the bets that I've noticed have a lot of potential for this card. So for starters, it's going to be Diego Lopes. I really like Diego Lopes's skills, especially when you consider his statistical advantages here. He has a height advantage of 3 inches. He's 4 years younger than Brian Ortega, who, by the way, doesn't look to be in really good shape. Regardless of the reason here, you have to acknowledge that Brian Ortega doesn't really look to be in amazing shape. And I think that makes Diego Lopes a good favorite to lean on here. So he does also have a reach advantage of 3 inches. He has a 17% higher striking accuracy. He absorbs 2.46 less strikes per minute, and he lands 2.5 more submissions on average than Brian Ortega here. Now, all things considered, stats and outside of stats, I'm giving Diego Lopes a final 55.2% probability of victory, and I think he's a great favorite to feature on this card. And if you want some more in-depth analysis, please, I urge you to look at the video from earlier this week. I break down everything in a lot of detail. In fact, I only covered 9 fights, and that video was the longest I've ever done. It's an hour and 48 minutes, and it's not an hour of 48 minutes of fluff. Every single second has some valuable insight and analysis. It's not a bunch of crap. It's not a bunch of promotions. No, the bulk of the video, 99% of it, is really useful crap. So let's go ahead and look at the other inexpensive and confident favorite here. It's going to be Daniel Zellhuber, or Zellhuber, however you want to pronounce his last name. So Daniel here, he has a height advantage of 3 inches. He's 3 years younger. He has a reach advantage of 8 inches, which is key if he utilizes it properly. He has a 3% higher striking defense and a 34% higher takedown defense. All things considered, I really do like Daniel Zellhuber here. He has a 74% probability of victory, in my opinion, when I look at the statistical analysis from the 7 AI machine learning models, and I also incorporate all of my research outside of stats as well. So 73.5% probability of victory, I think, is a great favorite to feature as well. Now let's go ahead and jump into those bets. Now let's review the bets that I think have value for this card and have a good statistical and stylistic possibility of happening. Please disregard prop bets where you're picking the other fighter to win. I'll start from the top of the card and work my way down. You'll see that I've laid out a few options for you guys depending on how risk averse you are and how much risk you're willing to take. So for starters, for the Sean O'Malley versus Merab Dvalishvili fight, the main event, I would consider taking O'Malley via KO/TKO if you're leaning towards him, or if you're leaning towards Merab and trying to get a bit of an advantage here with an underdog, then take Dvalishvili via decision. I don't really see him getting a finish here, but I do see more of a probability based on his style for him to get a decision victory if it goes his way. Moving along, co-main event, we have Alexa Grasso versus Valentina Shevchenko. For that fight, let's not take unnecessary risks. That's a very 50-50 fight. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to, going from safest to riskiest, take the over 1.5, the over 2.5, 3.5, 4.5, or it going the distance. That's probably going to be your best bet in this fight. It's gonna go, maybe not the whole distance, maybe it will, because again, we've had 2 of their fights and we've seen how those have played out. But I know for a fact that it will have kind of an over. I mean, the chances of someone just finishing that fight early with both of those gals' styles, I just don't see that happening. So that's what I would, that's what I want to highlight for you guys if you're considering to do anything for the co-main event. I wouldn't take anything other than that. So for Brian Ortega versus Diego Lopes, moving on, great fight there. I would consider taking Lopes via KO/TKO. Nothing else in that fight really spoke out to me. I just see a good chance of Diego Lopes getting it done via KO/TKO, especially seeing Brian Ortega's condition right now. I think that there's a really good chance for that happening. Now, moving along, Daniel Zellhuber versus Esteban Ribovics. I would take Zellhuber via decision if you're looking for anything in that fight. Nothing else really spoke out to me there. For Ronaldo Rodriguez versus Ode Osborne, I really like taking Rodriguez via submission. Nothing else spoke to me in this fight. This was a very simple card to break down when it came to bets. I mean, there was not a lot of technicality into it. It was just very, here's what I mean. It was very obvious in my opinion. Especially once I did all my research, this is what spoke out to me. So let's go ahead and move on from Rodriguez versus Osborne. When we're talking Irene Aldana versus Norma Dumont, let's not make it fancy. I know some of you guys are leaning towards Aldana, some of you guys are leaning towards Dumont. Let's keep things simple here. You can't go wrong in women's MMA for taking this kind of a bet. Over 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, 4.5, or it going the distance if you really want to roll the dice. Again, from less risky to highest level of risk, from less risk to reward to highest level risk of reward. So regardless of what side of the spectrum you're on, and that's why I hope you really find value in these videos, is because I try to find you guys the most neutral to safe risk to reward type of bets. So if I am going to highlight something, it's either a great bang for your buck, especially the stats and the stylistic backup for it, or I'm going to give you safe bets that are a bit neutral when fights are very 50-50, like we saw for the Valentina fight, like we saw for the Aldana fight. Anyways, continuing. Yasmin Yaragüe, however you say your last name, versus Caitlin Souza. I would consider, again, women's MMA, just to be safe here. Let's not pick a side. Let's not go crazy. If you don't want to take that money line, let's be a little bit safe. Over 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, 4.5 distance. Lastly, for a great fight, to start off this card, we have Raul Rosas Jr. versus Ari Quilang. I would consider taking Rosas Jr. via submission, or maybe the under 2.5, because this kid likes to go in and get things done as quick as possible. So I think that there's a good chance of that happening as well if you want to roll the dice a bit. A little bit risky, but also a reward there. I would kind of avoid Manuel Torres versus Ignacio Bahamondes, and just to be a little bit safe. And I would also avoid Edgar Chairez versus Joshua Van. You don't really know what to expect in that fight. I mean, Edgar was the favorite with his first matchup, but now that he's facing Joshua Van's the favorite. But here's the twist, right? A lot of people are saying Joshua Van might not be prepared, or this is short notice, so Edgar Chairez is more likely to win. I'm not going to make that determination here, and I'm not going to advise you guys to do so either. We're going to play it logical, we're going to play it safe, we're going to get some money on this card. And with that said, that wraps up this video. I really appreciate you all for watching and being so supportive as always. Please make sure to like and subscribe, and check out that Patreon if you want to support me through there as well. There's a $10 a month contribution tier and a $20 a month premium tier, which includes early results, picks, and bets, and also includes premium data, analysis, and stats as well. Your support helps keep me encouraged and motivated to continue running all of this data and analysis for you guys and providing you guys all these insights. So thank you once again, and as always, see you guys in the next one.